Hi everyone. I thought I'd just create this video today to basically talk about what we call the JP switch. It's essentially a system which people who start an MBTI try to use to get to an understanding of what their Socionics type might be. It works on a certain assumption that one, extroverted types in MBTI are going to be similar or near identical towards their Socionics counterparts. At the same time, there are different rules in terms of what makes a judger and a perceiver in MBTI compared to in Socionics. In MBTI, it's that if you're judging cognitive function in the top two slots, if that is extroverted, you must be a judger. Whereas if your perceiving function is extroverted, you must be a perceiver. In Socionics, is different. The leading function, the top one, that's what decides whether you are a judger or a perceiver, what we call an irrational or rational type. And what Socionics basically does is say, no, if your leading function is rational, you're a rational type. If your leading function is irrational, you're an irrational type. Now, that's fine if you're an extrovert, because that means that the extroverted function is the leading function. And so it's whether it's rational or irrational gets to decide whether that type is rational or irrational. When it comes to MBTI, it isn't. Often, when it comes to introverts, you have the case where it's the auxiliary function, the second one down, that is extroverted. And so that one's rationality decides whether the type is a judging or perceiving type. So what people tried to do was say, okay, extroverts, one-to-one correlation, very easy. When it comes to introverts, it becomes a lot more, a little bit more complex. You have to adopt a special rule. You have to say that you treat it like a one-to-one correlation, but you switch the J and the P, and then the one-to-one correlation works fine. Now, what I would say is that this is based on an oversimplification of the differences between the Myers-Briggs type indicator, or at least the theory and community surrounding it, and the ideas surrounding it, and Socionics and how it's practiced. Now, there are a number of differences for this. You may find through MBTI, one, that people reach their typing in MBTI via different ways, either by taking the Myers-Briggs type indicator, which works on dichotomies, so extrovert, introvert, intuitive sensing, thinking, feeling, judging, perceiving. So that's one approach. I find it's very behavioralist, defines things like, for instance, you get your energy by talking to others, interacting with others, versus you get your energy by spending time alone. It's very sort of behavioralist in its approach. The other approach is the cognitive functions way. The more Jungian cognitive function purists tend to use this and find these more of the internet rather than necessarily MBTI practitioners. What they do is they take definitions of cognitive functions, which often you have to pick and choose which definitions you want to use because there are different ones used by different people. Say Lenore Thompson's will differ from one which is set out in a particular internet profile. You also have to take in mind what Jung initially said in Jung's psychological types. So people don't pay that a lot of attention. When they do, they use it to claim greater authenticity. But at the same time, you have a difficulty whereby Jung's focusing on people who have mental illnesses rather than focusing on day-to-day, everyday people who are mostly well-functioning. So there are lots of difficulties then in terms of how you work out exactly which cognitive functions are. But either way, it's focused on being purely cognitive information processing, not to do with behavior. And we find some people like a guy called Gage Brown who wrote special cognitive function-based MBTI profiles. He doesn't say it's MBTI, just says Jungian cognitive functions, the psychological types. He'll say, well, no, it's got nothing to do with behaving what you do. It's simply to do with your paradigms and ways of viewing the world. So you've got that disconnect there between the very purely cognitive approach to the Myers-Briggs theory, and then you have the more behavioralist view used by the actual practitioners. And those two can easily contradict. There's no necessary way in which one has to derive from the other. So that's one difficulty with how you reach your type in MBTI. But that difficulty then percolates towards how you reach an MBTI type, and from that, work out what your Socionics type might be. Now, I'm going to look at it in terms of both approaches. So first of all, I'm going to say what these differences are. The reasons for the difference between Socionics and MBTI, both from a cognitive function perspective and from a dichotomy perspective. So we start first with dichotomies, extrovert and introvert. I said before, but extroverts are defined by getting energy through their interactions with people, interactions with others. Introverts, energy from reflecting on the time alone. Now that's going to pose certain difficulties because, well, essentially, it biases the idea of extroversion towards socializing, interpersonal interaction. Whereas when it comes to socionics, we say that energize is more to do with energy in general, a breadth perspective rather than the depth perspective. So it's not pure to do with being social. What this means is that if you are a thinker, if you're a logical type in socionics, you are more likely to be more introverted when translating through to MBTI. And if you're more like to be an ethical type in socionics, you're more like to be an extrovert in MBTI. So you find that ethical integrators in socionics can end up as being extroverted, whereas logical energizers can end up as being introverted. So that's one difficulty. Second difficulty, intuition versus sensation. I find that it's mostly okay in terms of how the dichotomy is defined formally, but in terms of how people then take these views and what the culture is around the Myers-Briggs theory, you find that intuitors are seen as special and rare and more intelligent and possessing greater insight, and sensors are seen as common garden and boring and traditionalist, especially for SJs. That's more Keirsey's influence on the theory, and essentially undesirable. You have a lot of social pressures which may cause people in MBTI communities, if they are sensing, to say, no, I'm more intuitive, or if they're simply just intellectually curious sensors, if they say an ESE or an LSE is developing their extrovert intuition, they may say, no, I'm not like a sensor, I'm more like an intuitor. And so they'll try and see themselves as being more of an intuitive type. At the same time, when you have a system which lays out very clearly the strengths of intuition, but doesn't do a lot of work in emphasizing the strengths of sensation and how it's also a good thing, it has its own merits to bring to the world, and not enough energy is put towards that because of anti-sensor bias, well, it creates a very sort of an environment where you will need to become more of an N to feel accepted rather than an S. So that's another difficulty. In socionics, sensors are a lot more balanced out of intuitors. There's far less pressure against them to become more intuitive or to fit in, as it were, with that particular community. So that's another difficulty. Thinking and feeling. Now, this one, it can be all right, but more often it's not, because usually how it's tested, if rather than focusing on people versus things, ends up focusing a lot more on being warm-hearted versus tough-minded. Now, the difficulty here is that in socionics, we see extrovert sensation information as being the source of that toughness and combativeness. And it's detached from being person-oriented. You can be a tough person, a coercive person, while also being very tuned into people in socionics. And MBTI is not very good at focusing on these distinctions. So what you end up having is that a lot of people in or types like the EIE or the SEE, even though they're person-oriented, because they're also very tough and very assertive, they can end up being very assertive and confrontational, they end up becoming more like thinkers in the MBTI. Even if it's not really to do with thinking, it's to do with being tough-minded while also being person-oriented. In the same way, you get types like the LII and the SLI in socionics ending up being feeling types in the MBTI because they're so gentle and so non-confrontational. Finally, we get to judging perceiving. I think this is one which has probably the least correlation or relevance to socionics. It's basically how organized you are. Now, we can measure organization very well. We use conscientiousness in Big Five for that. It exists on the scale. To be fair, all of them exist on a scale in the MBTI way of testing. We've seen that in various research, which hasn't shown bimodal variation. But either way, when it comes to judging, you can't attach this to any particular cognitive function. You can't say that because you have extroverted thinking, extroverted feeling, you're going to plan more. Because you can for extroverted thinking, because it's more about productivity, more about efficiency. For extroverted feeling, there's no connection between that and planning and organizing your day. So it's very difficult to see how that relates to socionics, specifically with the feeling judging types. Now, when it comes to socionics, well, we have a far more nuanced definition. It's about being motivated by oughts and shoulds versus what is and could be. So, yeah, it doesn't really have any connection to judging organization. So that can also cause lots of switches over between them. So there's no dichotomies. That's going to focus on the cognitive function. I would say when it comes to cognitive functions, it's easier for intuitives to switch over. I think the way that they're defined, at least with intuition, is a lot closer to how Socionics defines the information intelligence elements. But when you get to the senses, I think it becomes very different. I think there's a reason for this. I think it's because of Keirsey's influence and his setting out of the SPs and the SJs. This isn't really MBTI, but people treat it as if it is. And his idea of the SJs being very sort of traditionalist and well more conservative, even more authoritarian to a degree, especially the more sensing thinking judging types. Now that relates a lot more to introverted logic and extroverted sensation in socionics, the idea of imposing your structure or understanding onto reality. Whereas in socionics, our understanding of introverted sensation, extroverted thinking, extroverted logic is far more practical, far more day-to-day, more to utility and functionality, doing a good job, what you're working on, more laid back, as it were. And that would probably, that often is found to connect up more to the STPs in MBTI, the way they find extroverted sensation, introverted thinking. They've made it a lot more perceivery, a lot more relaxed, a lot more spontaneous, which works or correlates more to extroverted thinking in socionics, extroverted logic. So what they've done is they've taken the STJs and they've made them more J-ish. They've almost redefined the cognitive functions to make them sound more J-ish. And they've taken the STPs and they've redefined the cognitive functions there to make them sound more P-ish. As a result, the cognitive functions do not correlate with the across from MBTI to socionics nearly as well as for the intuitive ones. So you actually are better off just going by dichotomies and not doing the JP switch. But even that, I'd say, is still not ideal. There are a lot more differences, which I described before, the dichotomies, the other ones specifically, that made this not an easy way of transferring across. Now, another way in which MBTI often types people, well, not the MBTI, the official one, but how enthusiasts tend to use it, especially towards celebrities, they use certain stereotypes. For instance, ENTPs are seen as the inventor people, the ones who invent things, are creative in how things work. And so people then seem to type any sort of inventor, any sort of harebrained inventor as some sort of ENTP. Now, difficulty there is you end up getting a lot of LSEs typed as ENTP. This is more often something you find with celebrity typings. Such as Benjamin Franklin on celebrity types as types in the ENTP. It's a very good example of how you take something as an LSE, focus on extroverted logic, functionality, how things are working, and improving how things are working, and say, right, this is actually extroverted intuition with introverted thinking for some reason. And there's no sign of introverted thinking being used in a sort of valued sense with Benjamin Franklin. So stereotypes come to play. Same thing with the ENTJs being given to, well, the typing ENTJ being given to lots of dictators. Traditionalists ending up being guardians. It's these sorts of stereotypes have run amok a lot in celebrity typings and famous typings. Okay, so what I'd like to do now is just run through each type and go through these certain differences. Now, you'll find with ENTP, it's probably the best in terms of correlations between the two systems. Most ENTPs would probably end up as ILEs. I'm a good example of this, but it's not perfect. I say you may find LSEs instead for ENTPs. You may even find some ESEs. Most, yes, so those are some. Also, you may even find EIEs as well for ENTP translating across to the different socionics types. But yeah, on the whole, I'd say ILE, it works quite well. The rule people are using works all right for the ENTPs. It doesn't work so well for many of the others. Go to INTP. Now, lots of INTPs end up as being ILEs again. It's because of the the extroversion introversion problem. Essentially, if you are well, ILEs are not necessarily particularly sociable. I'm not especially sociable myself, to be fair. But anyway, yes, you find that difficulty makes a lot of ILEs ending up as INTPs in MBTI. Then say we go to ENTJ. This is where there's there's a big difficulty. You've got the stereotype of sort of field marshal dictator, coming more from Keirsey, I find, and you get a lot of SLEs end up being typed as ENTJ because they're more commanding, more authoritative. You can also get other types. You can end up. I've seen the celebrity typings. A number of EIEs ending up being typed as ENTJ because they're so tough and authoritarian. I think some people actually try to say that Adolf Hitler, for instance, was an ENTJ, even though his approach was very much extroverted feeling, just using a very authoritative, very manipulative and assertive, dictatorial sort of way. They thought it must be a thinker, can't be a feeler, because feelers can't kill people. So that's another difficulty. INTJ. Now this one's an interesting one. Again, the extrovert introvert issue, you get a lot of LIEs typed as INTJs. I know quite a few. My friend Peter is a good example of this. It's probably even more common than ILEs ending up as INTPs. You do get as well a good number of ILIs as INTJs. That should work with PJ switch. It does work to some degree, but not as well as we'd like it to. And there are plenty of examples where you could easily go wrong if you try to use it. You can also find a number of LSIs typed as INTJ because of a similar sort of, well, people who confuse sort of stubbornness and intellectualness you may get from LSI with the sort of skepticism of INTJ. It's easy to do. But yeah, so those are the NTs, which as I described, and how they can be, moved across. I've even seen ESIs typed as INTJ, more in famous people. It's usually when they're very intellectual ESIs like Christopher Hitchens. Now moving on to the NFs, it's well, let's see. I say ENFP is probably one can be all sorts. When Lightov did this with Keirsey, found that his IEEs are more like to be ESFPs, and okay. So we're ENFP. What do you have? So you have you can go across to IEE, so that'd be what we would expect. But surprisingly, because of this JP issue, you expect well, EIEs are suddenly expected to be very sort of capable of structure and getting their head together. When usually, because they're so dominated by their emotionality and their expressiveness, they can be quite chaotic. For example, being Russell Brand. So something like that ends up being typed in ENFP rather than ENFJ because of the PJ requirement, the need for them to be very organized and very sort of structured. Because that presents a clear difficulty. So yeah, a lot of ENFPs ended up actually being EIEs. You still get IEs as well, so that's beneficial. You also get a number of IEIs ended up as ENFPs. Why? Because they tend to be can be a bit more gregarious if they are, person oriented. So that's a difficulty. Now we go to INFP. Now here the cognitive functions going across works reasonably well. I'd say on the balance more INFPs are EIIs. That's what people at PJ Switch would say. But you can get almost as many ending up as IEIs, going by dichotomies rather than the cognitive functions. So yeah, it's not as simple as that, really. You can also get a number of LIIs being INFPs. Why? Because of the thinking feeling thing, warm-hearted, tough-minded. Now, ENFJ, I actually find that yes, you'd expect ENFJ to translate EIE, sort of, but because EIE sort of don't have that sort of stability so often compared to ENFJ, what ENFJs are meant to be, you actually find more ES ending up as ENFJs, especially those which are more intellectually curious. You may even find SEEs ending up as ENFJ. Or I've even seen examples of LSEs ending up as ENFJ, especially sort of the stereotype of ENFJ being faced with proactive, responsible, do-goodery, that sort of thing, which doesn't really translate to the more sort of dramatic and more emotions and meaning granting EIE seen in Socionics. Finally, with INFJ, well, an interesting thing bucks the trend. You may find a lot of EIEs ending up as INFJ. Well, because a lot of EIEs actually withdraw from sort of day-to-day social communications to focus on getting a more mysterious image or not having more control over their image. So often that translates to actually not being so day-to-day socializing, and so they may end up being typed as INFJs. They may end up being more reflective than what you'd expect for an ENFJ. Again, you'd find that most INFJs, I think, on the whole, end up as IEIs. I know Pekoki is a good example of that. But you'd also find another of INFJs ending up as EII with dichotomies carrying over. Now, let's go to the sensors. And this is where cognitive functions probably have less sway and dichotomies probably have more sway on the whole. So going to ESTP, well, Lightov looked at this and it still carries through an MBTI because ESTPs are tough-minded. You also find that SEEs are also tough-minded, and so they don't end up becoming as feelers when going through to MBTI. They end up being ESTPs. So SEEs are most often ESTPs. Also, ESTPs are characterized as being far more independence-oriented than what you expect from an SLE, whereas that fits SEE very, very well. So actually, ESTP becomes more often SEE than SLE. So yeah, that's probably the most common difficulty there. Now, when you go to ISTP, like I said, this is the difficulty described before: TISE, SITE, and essentially the meanings have been switched around. TIS has been perceiverized, and so I'd say on average, you could put ISTP across to SLI reasonably well, rather than what you'd expect with the PJ switch of being LSI. Yeah, so there's that difficulty. You may also find that some of the less sociable SLEs can end up as being ISTP. Then we get to ESTJ. Well, seen as quite dictatorial, so very authoritarian, very traditionalist in its approach. It's quite a very tough, very sort of uncompromising stereotype. I find it's most often you find this type ending up being SLE, not LSE. And in terms of celebrity typings, I've even seen ESI end up as ESTJ. I think, for example, say Margaret Thatcher or Theresa May most recently. So there are difficulties there in terms of how ESTJ is seen in MBTI versus in Socionics, when they're far more practical and actually quite unwilling to push what they think onto others so much. They're more self-sufficient. ISTJ. Actually, no, but what I was going to say about ESTJ could also be LSIs quite a bit, especially the more aggressive and more domineering LSIs can end up being more typed as ESTJ. Now, ISTJ. Now, the clear translation would be LSI now. Again, going by dichotomies now rather than cognitive functions. Cognitive functions don't match up so well. It's less often you'll find an SLI ended up as an ISTJ. Well, I've seen it happen based on type tests, based on dichotomy-based tests. I've seen it happen as well. You may also find ESIs ending up as ISTJ here as well, because again, they're tough-minded. So yeah, now moving on to ESFP. You may find that these are more often to be IEEs, which is interesting. It's an interesting example when actually intuitive type becomes more sensing. You'll find this with the Delta NFs actually, because they value extroverted thinking and introverted sensation. They're more like to embrace more sensing-based behaviors. So that's something to keep in mind. Then you have yes, ESFP is more likely to be IEs, but also ESEs, because ESFP is counted as being more fun-oriented, more sort of happy-go-lucky, less less dominant than you may expect an SEE to be. So a lot of ESEs may end up as ESFP. You may even see SEIs as ESFP, because SEIs are often translate across to being more extroverted types because they're so sociable. So that's quite a bit to keep in mind there. And less often you see ESFPs actually end up being SEEs. ISFP. Now, I find this most often ends up as SEI because of the way the cognitive function is being perceiverized, and this idea of ISFP being focused on aesthetic, being more sort of creative in a sort of physical, down-to-earth sort of way. Although you find when it comes to stereotype, a lot of musicians, even very intuitive musicians, ones which I type as EIE, end up being typed as ISFP because they are creative musicians, singer-songwriters, rather than world leaders. It's a typical stereotyping coming in again. So yeah, that's what I'd say for ISFP. You may also find SLIs ending up as ISFP because of the, because they're less tough, because they're more introvert sensation oriented rather than extrovert sensation oriented. So they end up becoming more warm-hearted rather than tough-minded. Now, ESFJ, you can find a reasonable correlation with ESE, but you can also find it with ESI, because again, this is the more, if you've J-ified it, you've made it more sort of guardian, more a degree of sort of traditionalist authoritarianism. ESE can cross over onto that because of their SE demonstrated, but it's not necessarily the case. Whereas ESI can also stray onto that quite a bit. You may even find some SEEs, but it's less often because they tend to be quite independent. I've even seen some EIE end up as ESFJs, which is interesting. So yeah, that's a complicated one. I find the ESFJ is probably the most often complained about in MBTI forums. It's the one people often heap their negative emotions on, quite unfairly, in my opinion. Same with ESTJ, but it's less complained about. Okay, and finally, ISFJ. Now, ISFJ, because it's been J-ified, I'd say it does lead to one typing ESIs as ISFJ, although you can also get some SEIs as ISFJ. But what I find most interesting, I described before with ENFPs to ESFPs, is that you find quite a large number of EIIs being ISFJs. Why? Because again, the delta values make them accept SITE more in the socionic sense. They're can be quite self-sacrificing, can have been quite sort of dutiful in a way, and yeah, and that often translates towards more guardian-y TSC behaviors rather more idealist behaviors. So that's an interesting switch there. So yeah, that would be my approach to how you translate MBTI types through to Socionics. As I said before, it's complicated. It's not as easy as just a JP switch, and I wouldn't recommend employing that as a means of working out your type. It's far better to go to Socionics, approach it with a blank slate, learn it for what it is, and type yourself within that system, or find someone who knows Socionics well enough to type you. Don't just assume that based on your MBTI type, you are this type in Socionics. It's an almost sure way that you end up with failure in terms of typing yourself. So yeah, thank you very much, everyone. Have a lovely day. Bye-bye.